Welcome to Nobilis Erotica episode 363. I am your host, Nobilis Reed. This episode of Nobilis Erotica is sponsored by the generous patronage of Nobilis Erotica listeners. If you'd like to help out paying the authors and voices that create these stories, visit patreon.com/Nobilis. And if you're already a patron, thank you so much for your help. So hey, January 2017 marks 10 years that the Nobilis Erotica podcast has been in existence. The actual birth date is on, January 30th for the first episode that I posted, and January 31st for the first episode that I posted that I actually left in the feed. Like a lot of new podcasters, my first episode had some mistakes in it, and I posted a replacement file the next day. Anyways, here's what that podcast sounded like way back in January 2007. Conrad unbuckled his pants and dropped them on the ground. His keys and coins clashed against the tiles. With another swift motion, his boxers joined them, and his full, pulsing prick lowered like the guns of the New Jersey taking aim. He placed one hand cradling Hannah's sex and the other on her hips, and gently guided his cock into position. Slowly he eased his way in, savoring the sensation. "Damn it, Conrad, fuck me!" Hannah was almost shouting. She slammed her body backwards, pushing off from the wall, impaling herself on Conrad's member. Conrad smiled and tried not to laugh. "She's going to hear you," he said, quietly, as he started a gentle rhythm with his hips. "I don't care," Hannah grunted, and pushed backwards again. "Harder!" Conrad smiled and obliged her. Back then, I was getting PodSafe music from the PodSafe Music Network. I was recording mostly my own stories, which were, all over the map. Since then, I've written a pile of short stories and novellas. I've written 3 novels, podcasted one of them in this feed. I've gotten to present stories written by people like Laura Antonio, Cecilia Tan, Marianne Mohanraj, and N.K. Jemisin, as both fellow podcasters and as fans. And since then, between the sales of ebooks, audiobooks and apps, sponsorships, and most recently the Patreon campaign, the podcast has not only been paying for its own hosting, I can even pay the authors and voice talents who help bring these shows to you. I don't think I could have imagined back in 2007 where I'd be now. I had dreams, but they were really vague. Just knew what I wanted to do, and I was going to set out and do it. The podcast was intended from the beginning to be the kind of podcast I wanted to listen to, and that's all there was to it. And here it is. It is what I wanted to listen to. So anyways, in honor of that first episode, I'm bringing you some fiction written and read by yours truly. If any of you remember a podcast from a few years back called Podcaturday that I was involved with, you might have heard the title of this one, but I've never actually put the audio in the feed. So I figure the 10-year anniversary was a really good day to bring this one out. It's in some ways quintessentially Nobilis Reed, and in some ways something I've never done before. So I hope you like it. Here you go. Inspector Grape and the Confounding Case of the Killer Corset by Nobilis Reed. Professor Pinkatoot's bosom wax. Whatever is such a thing for? The woman standing at the door was dressed as demurely as any woman ought to be. Her waist was tightly corseted, her dress was buttoned securely all the way up to her neck, and her gloves were tucked neatly into her sleeves. Her face was the only skin showing. Still, she had the audacity to fail to blush as she said, "Just what it says on the tin, Inspector Grape." He rolled the tin over in his hand and squinted at the fine print on the back. "For the enhancement of the texture and appearance of the bosom. Balderdash! No doubt concocted out of snake oil and snipe feathers." Inspector Grape put the tin down on the dressing table and picked up 2 more tins.
Professor Pinketooth's keister balm. Professor Pinketooth's nether ointment. For a spinster, your sister seemed more than a little concerned with the texture and appearance of portions of her anatomy nobody else but herself should see. The younger Miss Trunkle, who was now the only Miss Trunkle, straightened up and gave the inspector a cold stare. "A lady takes pride in her appearance, even when she's not going out, doesn't she? I'll thank you not to deride my late sister's choice in cosmetics." Inspector Grape twitched his impressively waxed moustache and returned the tins to their places. "Do you use these products, Miss Trunkle?" She stuck her nose in the air, looking away, even though there was colour coming up in her cheeks. "I'll thank you to leave my own personal toilette out of your investigation, Inspector." "Miss Trunkle, there hasn't been a death by catastrophic corset failure in this city for at least 5 years. If I am to determine whether her demise was intentional, then any fact may be relevant." "So is that why you pawed through my sister's underthings? Because it seems to me that the cause of her accident was clear. The corset was of shoddy construction. If there's anyone you should be questioning, it's her corsetier. Underwear should not explode. One would think that that goes without saying." "Oh, don't you worry, Miss Trunkle. We shall be questioning Monsieur le Pont Suspendu, that's for certain." Inspector Grape shoved his hands into the pockets of his coat and continued his perusal of the room. "You didn't answer my question. Do you use these products? Or shall I have a look at your dressing table as well?" "I am familiar with them, yes." "But you do not use them habitually?" "No." "Tell me, Miss Trunkle, did your sister have any particular enemies? Anyone who might want her dead?" "No, not at all. She was rather eccentric, after all. Absolutely hated going out of the house or meeting new people. Spent all her time on the ethograph." She nodded at the desk in the corner, where a terminal sat, bloodstains still drying on the well-polished mahogany and brass. Inspector Grape bent down and read the words on the screen, likely the last words read or typed by the deceased. "Oh dear, I do believe my corset is making a rather unusual noise," he said, jotting them down in his notebook. "See," said Miss Trunkle. "It was the corset." "All right, then," said Inspector Grape, finishing his circuit of the deceased's bedchamber. "I should inform you that you are under suspicion in this case, Miss Trunkle. I should advise you not to leave town." "Suspicion," she said, with a huff. "After all, it is you that will inherit the Trunkle estate. Motive enough, wouldn't you say?" "Of course not. I would never." Inspector Grape harumphed and exited the room. "Good afternoon." Inspector Grape sighed as he came through the front door, letting the scent of pot roast wash the stresses of the day from his brain. The dining-room table was already set, complete with a bowl of fresh flowers. "Professor Pinketooth. Ever heard of him, dear?" he asked. "No," said Mrs. Grape, entering from the kitchen. "Can't say I have." The inspector hadn't married her for her looks. Oh, she wasn't exactly ugly. In fact, she had a quite comely face, but she was built like an obelisk. Tall, pale, and not a single curve from her shoulders all the way to the ground. No, he had married her because she could cook better than a 5-star kitchen automaton, and because she was sharper than a whole airship full of knives. An airship full of really sharp knives. She gave him a tender kiss on the cheek and put her hand on his arm. "Difficult day, dear?" "It's the Trunkle case," he said, taking off his hat and coat and handing them to the clockwork manservant. "The younger Miss Trunkle doesn't seem the least perturbed that her sister had met a violent and gruesome end, and only this morning. If you ask me, there's something mighty suspicious about that." "That does seem strange." Mrs. Grape returned to the kitchen and retrieved a large iron pot with a clockwork mechanism bolted to one side. The mechanical butler trundled away, clicking softly to itself, while the inspector sat in his accustomed place across from his wife. She flicked a toggle on the pot, and a cover ratcheted open to reveal a pot roast, mashed potatoes, and green beans. Mrs. Grape said, "Does she have a motive?" as she portioned out the meal into 2 large plates. "She most certainly does. Stands to inherit a princely sum." "How is it done?" asked Mrs. Grape, calmly. Inspector Grape took his plate and inhaled the succulent aroma. "Ah, that's the strangest part of it. Corset failure." He cut his meat into bite-sized pieces, careful to keep them separate from the other items. "Corset failure?" "Yes, very bizarre. I'm surprised you haven't already heard it on the ethograph. The mainspring broke, drove straight into her spine, killed her instantly." "Oh my, that is gruesome," said Mrs. Grape, with a twinkle in her eye. "Had the corset been tampered with?" The inspector took out his notebook and laid it on the table next to his dessert fork. "The boys in the clockwork lab say there's no sign of interference. All as it should be." "So the violence of the event was solely due to the accumulated elastic stress of the corset?" She delicately placed a morsel of beef in her mouth and chewed. "It appears that way. I found it quite unbelievable myself until I had seen the results. Usually corsets aren't capable of such behavior." "One would hope. Was the elder Miss Trunkle of particularly prodigious figure?" He flipped a page and scanned his notes. Coroner doesn't mention it. Coroner doesn't mention it, and the good doctor never fails to mention such details." She pursed her lips. "Have you spoken with the corset maker?" He flipped another page. "That would be one Monsieur Le Ponce Suspendu. He said that the mainspring was in fact capable of exploding, but that it would only do so under extreme stress." "A bit like a New Englander," said Mrs. Grape. The inspector harumphed. "Quite. He reported that this model, when tested, only failed if bursting stresses of more than 100 pounds per square inch were applied. I assume that is quite a lot." "Indeed," said Mrs. Grape. "Did Monsieur Le Ponce Suspendu make his customers aware of this flaw?" "Oh, yes. He reported that all customers are cautioned to treat the lace tightener with respect." "Was there anyone present in the house of unusual strength, a circus strongman, or perhaps a rhinoceros?" Inspector Grape looked over his notes, turning pages back and forth. "No evidence of either. Could it have been a cooperative venture, 3 or 4 people pulling on it simultaneously?" "Don't be ridiculous, Herbert. 3 or 4 people trying to get a woman out of a corset by brute force?" Inspector Grape covered his embarrassment by taking a big forkful of mashed potatoes. "Excellent gravy tonight, by the way." "Thank you, dear." The couple sat for a few minutes, the sounds of silverware against dishes and thoughtful mastication punctuating their conversation, as the inspector gave his wife a full briefing on the case. When they had both finished eating, Mrs. Grape picked up their plates and brought them to the kitchen. "Was there anything else unusual in the house?" Inspector Grape consulted his notebook. "I'm not sure. There were some things on the victim's dressing table that seemed out of the ordinary, but not being familiar with such things—" He trailed off, waving one hand in a helpless little circle. "And they were?" Mrs. Grape returned from the kitchen with 2 small dessert bowls, each containing a square of apple cobbler and a melting ball of ice cream. "Some cosmetics," he said, choosing his words carefully. "A whole assortment of them, formulated by this Professor Pinkertooth fellow I was asking about earlier." "Really? What sort of cosmetics?" Mrs. Grape set one bowl in front of her husband and then sat down with the other. Inspector Grape sat with his fork poised over the confection. "Bosom wax." A bit of color came to his normally pasty complexion. "Bosom wax?" "And Keisterbomb." She raised an eyebrow in his direction, eyeing the fork. "Really?" Inspector Grape checked his notes, fork still hovering in midair. Yes, and—" "Yes?" Inspector Grape's countenance took on a tone yet ruddier still. "Nether ointment. Professor Pinkertooth's nether ointment." "Dear," said Mrs. Grape. "Yes?" "Do eat your dessert. The ice cream is melting." "Oh." He looked down as if discovering the bowl for the first time. He engaged the fork in its usual manner. After a carefully savoured bite, he said, "Brilliant." "Thank you, dear." When the cobbler a la mode was finished, which wasn't long because Mrs. Grape believed that large desserts were a hindrance to proper cognition, they retired to a pair of wing-back chairs next to the fire. Inspector Grape filled his pipe and lit it, puffing thoughtfully with the stem caught between his teeth. Mrs. Grape wheeled a large brass ethograph from its place in the corner and clacked away at the wooden keys, studying the results of her work in its array of tiny painted flippers. Inspector Grape had never had much patience with the thing, but since his wife had a keen interest and seemed able to find all sorts of interesting information with it, he had been happy to procure a top-of-the-line model. "Interesting," she said. "There does not appear to be a business registered within the city under the name Pinkertoot." "They could have come in from out of town, imported even." "Possibly. I will know more after some of my broader queries have had a chance to run, but it may be that these items were sold by a traveling salesman." "Ah, one of those fellows with the colourful wagon, the song and dance act, and the preposterous claims about what his remedy can accomplish." Inspector Grape ran his hand absent-mindedly over the skin exposed by his receding hairline. "Yes, perhaps, though in this case I think it much more likely that it was sold door to door. Products like these would attract unwanted attention." "In which case this Professor Pinkertoot fellow may well have sold his goods and moved on. Do you think it's relevant to the case?" "No clue is too obscure, dear," she smiled, "especially since we are talking about a possible murder by Corset. There may have been some sort of interaction. It might be to your advantage to return to the Trunkle estate and bring back those items. I should like to have a look at them." Inspector Grape grunted and put his pipe back in his mouth. "Well," she said. "What now?" "Have you got something better to do?" He growled and climbed out of his chair, shouting for the clockwork manservant to retrieve his hat and coat. An hour later, Inspector Grape returned with a grocery sack containing the entire contents of the elder Miss Trunkle's dressing table. He found his wife still sitting at the ethograph, clacking away. "Here you are," he said, holding out the sack. "That's the whole lot of them." "Excellent. Put them down right here. Let me show you something." She turned the display to face her husband and pointed. "This is Professor Pinkertoot." Staring back at him, in carefully rendered tiles of black and white, was the face of a man with round pince-nez spectacles, a top hat, and a fabulously curled handlebar moustache. "Expelled from the National College of Unguentarians, blacklisted by the Council on Speculative Medicine, and banned from the Manipulative Practitioner Society." "Whatever for?" Mrs. Grape narrowed her eyes. "The records are sealed, but I have my suspicions." She picked up the sack and removed items one by one until she came to the jar containing Professor Pinkertoot's bosom wax. As she carefully scrutinized the label, she made little hms and ahs as she turned it carefully in her hands. "Following his disgrace, he did, as we suspected, turn to door-to-door sales to make a living." She touched a finger to some of the fine print on the label. "For the enhancement of the texture and appearance of the female bosom, shine, smoothness, shape." Inspector Grape shook his head. "I still don't see how any of this is relevant." Mrs. Grape flicked her finger under the edge of the label and peered underneath, then unscrewed the jar. There was a large scoop taken from the center of the yellowish-pink contents, and a wad of the substance pulled up against the lip of the jar. "Perhaps," she said. "Perhaps not." She set the jar down and took a look at the other jar, the one labeled Professor Pinkertoot's Keister Bomb. Like the first, she examined the labels, and then opened the jar to find a similar shape scooped from the jar's contents, and a lump against the rim. "Do you see this?" she said. The inspector peered into the jar. Yes." He saw the little pit cut into the surface, but wasn't sure what to make of it. "This," she said, "wasn't made by fingers. This was made by some sort of implement, a spoon, perhaps, or some sort of applicator." Yes, well, of course."
"And here is where that implement was scraped against the lid to level it off."
"Indeed."
"This means that our elder Miss Trunkle was being rather careful about how much she used." Mrs. Grape perused the label once again. "There is no instructions in the package to that effect, so I can only conclude that she received the instruction from some other source."
"Perhaps this door-to-door salesman you mentioned."
"Perhaps, or perhaps not. Do you see that there is only one indentation? It seems likely that the use to which this preparation was made was the first."
Inspector Grape grunted and glowered. "The younger Miss Trunkle said that she had borrowed the cosmetics."
"Well, if she did, then the evidence of it was obliterated when the elder Miss Trunkle made these scoops. Either that, or she's lying." Mrs. Grape stood up and brought the jar into the kitchen, with the inspector hurrying to keep up. She hunted through the silverware for several moments, comparing the spoons one by one to the indentation in the wax. "Aha!" she said.
finding one that suited her purpose, and set it down on the kitchen table next to the jar. Then, with haste that Inspector Grape had not seen before, she began unbuttoning her dress. "Cloris!" exclaimed the inspector. "Whatever are you doing? It's not Thursday." Thursday nights were always difficult for Inspector Grape. Performing his husbandly duties was uncomfortably like attempting to impregnate an overfull golf bag. The idea that he should be expected to perform again on Monday was disturbing. The fact that the lights were still on was even more disturbing. "Have no fear, dear husband, I haven't gone mad. I'm simply testing a hypothesis." Inspector Grape ran to the window and pulled the drapes, then closed the kitchen door to make sure the clockwork manservant wouldn't see, then respectfully turned away while his wife disrobed. "Don't be silly, husband," she said. "If this works the way I think it does, then we shall be needing a witness." He turned back to discover that she had divested herself of everything except her underskirts, leaving herself bare from the waist up. There wasn't even the slightest bit of femininity to her body, and he felt no stirrings whatever at the sight. She carefully dug the spoon into the wax, scooped up a reasonable-sized glob, and scraped it against the rim, just as she had described before, and set it down on the counter. Then, with 2 fingers, she took half the contents of the spoon and applied it in a broad swath of skin surrounding one tiny pink nipple, then applied the remainder to the other. The affair seemed rather pointless. Inspector Grape said, "Doesn't seem to work. They look exactly the same." "Ah, don't be too sure, husband," she said. "I feel something of a tingle, and the fact that this so-called wax is being absorbed rather than simply affecting the surface begins to confirm my hypothesis." Inspector Grape scowled. "Well, that was rather pointless." Cloris closed her eyes and took a deep breath, pressing her hands against her nipples. "Oh, I don't know. It does feel rather pleasant." "Well, it's not supposed to be some kind of liniment." Then Mrs. Grape did something the inspector had rarely seen her do previously. As her hands made slow circles on her chest, the woman's eyes went half-lidded, and her head rolled to one side, as if a bolt had come loose. "My word," she said, rubbing harder at her chest. Inspector Grape pursed his lips, wondering how long this affair was going to take. Then his jaw fell slowly open, as the flesh under his wife's hands swelled. Like a mushroom appearing overnight in the middle of a carefully manicured lawn, he could not deny that where there had been nothing before, there was now something. 2 somethings, in fact, and they were starting to achieve a noticeable dimension. Mrs. Grape had noticed this effect as well. The pattern of her fingers against her skin changed, and instead of pushing flat against her chest, her hands cupped her now quite appreciable breasts. "Aha!" said Inspector Grape. "So that's how it's done. The elder Miss Trunkle expanded within the corset, causing the mainspring on the clockwork lace winder to explode." Mrs. Grape frowned, patted her chest, then regarded her bosom thoughtfully. "I don't believe that theory holds up under examination," she said. "The growth appears to have stopped, and while this may have added an inch or 2 to my circumference, I don't believe it's enough to have caused the event in question. Further inquiry may clarify matters, however." Deftly, she plucked at the buttons of her underskirts until they, too, fell to the floor, and she was left completely naked. Inspector Grape mused that she looked rather uncomfortably unstable, like a pin balanced on its tip, all of her weight resting well above her waist. She picked up the jar of Professor Pinkertooth's keister balm, opened it, and scooped a generous dollop onto the spoon. As before, she took half the measure in the fingers of each hand and lowered her hands to her posterior and applied the waxy substance. "Watch," she said, turning around, "and see what happens." Her voice was becoming breathy, and Inspector Grape wondered whether there wasn't some sort of drug in the mixture, something that might be affecting his wife's mind. Still, they seemed to be on the trail of a breakthrough in the case, so he cast his attentions to his wife's derriere, such as it was. Inspector Grape tried to remember when he had seen his wife's hind parts before. He couldn't think of even one time he had done so, and he was glad of it. What little muscle was there between her hips and her thighs lay flat against her skeleton, like tight twisted ropes. As with the bosom wax, however, the shape did not remain severe for long. After a good 5 minutes of massage, the flesh under Mrs. Grape's hands swelled and softened, replacing angularity with gentle curves. As his gaze traveled wider, the inspector realized that the changes had not been limited to her chest and pelvis. All over her body, the bony knobs and thready cords of her bones and muscles had been covered by a layer of smooth, succulent flesh. For the first time in his life, he found himself growing warm at the sight of his wife's body. When she turned to face him again, her eyes were hooded and her skin seemed flushed. "Are you, feeling all right, dear?"
"Wonderful," she replied. "I feel absolutely wonderful."
She drew closer and draped her well-upholstered body against his. She leaned in to whisper close to his ear.
"There's one more jar," she said. "How would you like to apply that one for me?"
"Well,
in the interest of justice and science," she breathed.
Of course," he stammered, finding his hand sliding into the small of her back.
"Good," she said, leaning back to retrieve the last of the Pinkertooth potions from the table. His eyes would not leave Mrs. Grape's body alone. He watched her legs flex and her torso sway as she gently took his hand and led him to the bedroom. His breath caught in his chest, and a queer sort of itchiness found its way into his gut. The four-poster bed was where they spent every night together, lying side by side with a good 2 feet of space between their bodies. Well, except for Thursdays. Thursdays. As he watched his wife lay down on the bed, he swallowed hard and thought that maybe, just maybe, Thursdays were going to be somewhat better than they had been before. Her breasts had grown even more as they were walking down the hall, and were now fleshy enough to bounce provocatively as she walked. She crooked a finger. "Come here," she said, in a voice that sounded as soft and welcoming as her new flesh looked. He stepped closer, and she handed the jar to him. It was smaller than the others, and when he opened the lid he found that there was only a small indentation in the center of the material, as if dug out by a finger rather than a spoon. He poked tentatively at the material. It wasn't as firm as the others had been, more like jelly than wax, and a significant dollop adhered to his finger when he pulled it away. There was a curious sensation in his fingertip, a warm, tingly feeling, a bit like a mild electric charge, only more pleasant. "Don't wait," said Mrs. Grape, spreading her thighs. "Apply it, please." The inspector crawled up onto the bed, careful not to smear the ointment on anything, and considered his wife's nether regions. He had never had a very good look at them before, having never had much reason to. The whole affair looked simple enough, just some fur and a little crease, so he ran his finger down and through, applying Professor Pinkertooth's nether ointment in a generous stripe right where the two lobes came together. He was a bit surprised when his finger met no resistance, but then he determined that there must be some sort of cavity in there, what with Thursday's activities and all, so he swallowed his ignorance and looked up at his wife's face. She arched her back, clutching at her bosoms with both hands. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, rub, right there, right there." Inspector Grape shrugged. "All right." As with the other preparations, the unguent disappeared rapidly from his finger, soaking into the flesh as it was replaced by a flow of musky fluid. He closed one eye and screwed up his face in concentration as he felt around beyond the threshold of her outer lips, finding all sorts of delicate knobs and membranes inside. Each brush of his finger seemed to provoke a new sound from his wife's throat, a moan or a sigh or a squeal, but the correlation between any given bit of skin and any given sound was difficult to correlate. Finally, Mrs. Grape said, in a desperate tone of voice, "Dear, I know it's not Thursday, but if you wouldn't mind." He looked up and nearly fell off the bed. While he had been engaged with the lower half of her body, her upper half had become positively enormous. The mounds of flesh that had been simple bosoms were now each larger than his head and swelling visibly as he watched. Inspector Grape had never had a term of endearment for his wife. He simply had never had need of one, and now that he finally came to the point of using one, he found only one source of inspiration. Or, to be more accurate, two sources of inspiration.
"Pumpkin," he said.
"Don't argue," she gasped. "I simply cannot wait until Thursday."
Inspector Grape couldn't find it in his heart to grumble. He kicked off his shoes, dragged off his pants, and took up his usual Thursday night posture. This time, however, was different. He didn't have to think those special thoughts, to get his body to cooperate. The sight of her bosom swelling slowly, throwing shadows first across the bed and now onto the floor and the wall, served much better. It didn't matter that the room was well lit and they were on top of the covers. Her body was soft, well padded, and inviting. He found himself moving instinctively, a warm, urgent contentment flowing through him, as Tuesday slid across the calendar and punched Thursday right in the nose. He was slightly perturbed when his wife cried out in what sounded like it might have been some sort of fit, but by then he was too immersed in the act to do any more than take note of it. He held on as she writhed beneath him, meeting her movements with his own, until he spent himself in a long groan that came from somewhere in his belly. Unable to hold himself up any longer, he allowed his body to fall against hers. As he recovered his wits, he found himself gradually rising up, pushed away from the bed by his wife's growing bust-line. They were now the size of barrels, and not the smaller ones that beer came in either. These were the size of old-fashioned oak whiskey barrels, like the ones at O'Malley's. "Pumpkin," he said, because calling her barrel didn't sound right. "Something's not right here." "Woof, woof, woof," she said. Inspector Grape climbed off her and pulled the expanding flesh away from her face. "Help me up," she said, taking a desperate gulp of air. He did what he could to get her sitting upright. The maneuver was made considerably more difficult by bosoms large enough to lie in her lap. "Dear Lord," he exclaimed, "how big will they get?" "Calm yourself, dear," said Mrs. Grape, much relieved now that the pressure was off. After all, they didn't need a steam carriage to carry away the elder Miss Trunkle. I'm sure the swelling will go down eventually. Inspector Grape gave his wife a crooked smile. "Any ideas on what we can do while we wait?" "You sweet talker, you," she said, smiling back.
"You may be wondering why I've gathered you all here," said Inspector Grape, pacing slowly in the Trunkle family parlor.
"I'm the only one here," said Miss Trunkle.
"What?"
She looked around the room and rolled her eyes.
"I'm the only one here."
Inspector Grape nodded to the patrolman who stood ready at the door.
"There's Officer Thompson."
"I'm sure he isn't wondering why he's here. You could have at least brought in Monsieur Le Pont Suspendu and Professor Pinkertooth."
"Yes, well, you are wondering why I've brought you here."
"You didn't bring me here. I live here. How did you become a police inspector anyways?" Inspector Grape waggled a finger under Miss Trunkle's nose.
"I will ask the questions here."
Miss Trunkle rolled her eyes again.
"It is a fact, is it not, that your elder sister was a complete agoraphobe and wouldn't even come into the front parlor when the door was open?"
"Yes."
"And it is not also a fact that you bought not one but 2 complete sets of products from Professor Pinkertooth? You must have, because the jars we took from your sister's room had only been used once."
"Yes, but I fail to see how."
"And you no doubt discovered that the synergistic reaction when all 3 preparations were used at the same time. In fact, you almost certainly were warned by Professor Pinkertooth as to the proper dosages and consequences."
Miss Trunkle frowned and sank a little in her seat.
"And no doubt you also knew that the problems with the lace tetanur from Monsieur Le Pont Suspendu. You put the 2 together, and bang, instant heiress."
"You'll never convict me," growled Miss Trunkle. "I've got no reason to kill my sister. We lived quite comfortably, sharing everything. I managed everything due to my sister's eccentricities."
"Yes, you had quite the comfortable life here. A life worth defending, no?"
"Why are you talking with that Belgian accent all of a sudden?"
"The evidence is right there, right on the screen. Oh dear, I do believe my corset is making a rather unusual noise. Those were the words on the screen. A woman of such modesty and grace as your sister wouldn't talk about anything as intimate as a corset with just anyone. No, it would have to be someone with whom she felt close, someone even she was in love with."
"You're insane."
"I am not insane, Miss Trunkle. It is you who saw your comfortable life slipping away, slipping through the keys of the ethograph, as your sister found a way to transcend her agoraphobia, to make a connection outside of this house. And when that happened, you knew that your control over the Trunkle fortune was coming to an end. So you acted. You introduced your sister to the products of Professor Pinkertooth, making sure that she would use them just before putting on her corset in the morning. And then, a few minutes after her corset was in place, bang! All right. Yes, you've discovered my plan. I did it. I set up the whole situation. Now will you please stop talking with that stupid accent?
Gladly, Miss Trunkle.
Inspector Grape rocked back on his heels. Gladly.
And there you have it. Did you like this story? Or do you want to wish me a happy 10th anniversary? Call the voicemail line. The number is 571-297-3325. Send me email, authornobilis@gmail.com. Or find me on Twitter. I am @Nobilis. Patrons of the Nobilis Erotica podcast enjoy monthly episodes of my fantasy serial, Bra of Holding. I just sent them chapters 13 and 14 a couple of days ago. And now that Patreon has activated RSS feeds for audio podcasts, you can get those episodes as easily as you get this one by signing up as a patron at patreon.com/Nobilis. You have been listening to the Nobilis Erotica podcast. Theme music is composed and performed by Mass Relay. This podcast is released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license. Until next time, listen hard.